everybody, I'm Nora Burrows, and I recently acquired 3 antique quilts. I went from having 0 to 3 antique quilts in the span of the past month, so that's really exciting for me. This is the first one and my most favorite of all of the 3. The way that I came to acquire this, my Uncle Timmy, who's actually my second cousin once removed, he's my mom's cousin, he is an antiques dealer, and I saw him at our family reunion over the summer. And I asked him about if he had any quilts, and he doesn't really typically have quilts. It's not what he specializes in, but he happened to have 2 quilts. And I said, do you have any pictures? And he said no, but he said he had a basket quilt, and then he had a star quilt. So he said, I'll send you pictures when I get home. So he did. He sent me a picture of this quilt. And as soon as I saw this quilt, I couldn't believe it, because let me tell you why. I had just been reading this book. It's called, and I did finish this book, so I'll give you a little book review in addition to talking about the 3 antique quilts. But this is called Legacy, The Story of Tallulah Gilbert Bottoms and Her Quilts. This is a fantastic book. This was written by Tallulah's granddaughter or great-granddaughter, I can't remember. But Tallulah grew up during the Civil War. She lived down in Georgia. And so this book kind of traces her journaling. Tallulah Bottoms was a big journaler. She talked a lot about her quilts in her journals and her life that she experienced during the Civil War growing up. A lot of her family passed away in various ways. She had a really, really difficult life in many aspects, but she persevered. She was a brilliant quilt maker. She's actually a pretty well-known quilt maker. I had never heard of her before I read this book, but since I've read the book, she's actually come up quite a few times. So I highly recommend this book. It is a little not so great getting started. I started to read it and I was like, I'm just gonna push through and get to the end because I felt like I should, but I wasn't really enjoying it. And then, you know, I don't know how far in, maybe like, I don't know, like let's say for argument's sake, like 6 pages in, I was sold and I loved it. I loved the whole thing. Anyway, the reason why I'm talking about this book is because the day before my Uncle Timmy had sent me the photos of this quilt, I had just read, let me get on the other side here, about this quilt that she made. This is the exact same quilt. So here's the birds and the flower, and then here's the full quilt on the side, and you can see the detailing along the border. I had just read about this quilt, and look, it's the exact same quilt. I could not believe it. And then I felt mighty good about myself because I felt like I knew something about the quilt that he had sent me. So I immediately texted him back. I said, you know, I described there's a little blurb here. I'll read you the blurb about the quilt. But I said, oh, I was just reading about this quilt and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so I bought the quilt from Timmy. And then the second quilt that I'll put up in a second was also from Timmy that he gave to me for free. It's quite stained. I actually really love this quilt, but we'll talk about that one in a second. But let me read you the blurb about this quilt here. And you can see the border is the same, right? So in this border, where is it? In this border, it goes all the way around 4 sides, but in this one, it doesn't go along the top. It just goes along 3 sides. It does go along the bottom down there. And what I also really love about this quilt is each one of the flowers is different. So I'll give you a closer look in a second, but let me read to you what it says about this quilt. It's called The Garden Bouquet. Tallulah pieced and appliqued this quilt for her daughter, Molly Ruth. So again, this is not the exact quilt that Tallulah made. It's just somebody else made it from the same pattern. But the one that I'm reading to you about is the one Tallulah made. All right, so Tallulah pieced and appliqued this quilt for her daughter, Molly Ruth, probably in 1932, and may have quilted it soon after. It is the first of at least 5 quilts Tallulah made by this Nancy Page design in the 1930s. The series of patterns and instructions clipped from Florence Leganke's column in the Nashville Banner, February to July of 1932. It is documented by the saved clippings and much perforated tissue paper patterns Tallulah used to cut out the pieces. The series of patterns and Florence Laganke's instructions, last name is spelled Laganke. So the series of patterns and Florence Laganke's instructions have recently been republished in 1987. So what I was thinking would be fun is I'd love to recreate this quilt. Not exactly, but to somehow trace the birds and the flowers and make my own birds and flowers. And then I've already kind of sketched out the basket design I want to do. I want the basket to be a little bit different than this. And then I don't want to have the empty diamonds. Every other, like this one, every other one is empty diamonds. I don't do a lot of quilting, so that's really what those empty diamonds are for, is to have that have the opportunity for your quilting to shine. And since I don't really do a lot of quilting, I would just kind of, I don't know, either put the bird basket blocks up against each other, add some sashing, something like that. But I'd like to do that. The other thing that's a bit of a mystery about this quilt is that the center part, everything that does not include the borders, both pink borders and the cream border, is hand pieced and hand quilted, but the borders are machine pieced and machine quilted, which you might think, okay, well, perhaps the maker of the quilt hand pieced the majority of the top, put it aside, and then someone else, you know, X many years down the road decided to finish it, and they machine pieced the edge borders. But then that doesn't quite make sense, because then they would have had to machine, you'd think that they would machine quilt the whole thing. So it seems like if you think about the order of making a quilt top and then sandwiching it together, somebody would have had to hand piece the center, then machine piece the border, then hand quilt the center, and then machine quilt the border. So in terms of order, it doesn't quite make sense for two people to have been, I don't know, I'm just speculating here. What I think happened is that the quilt maker made the center, pieced the center by hand, and then figured, the border isn't quite as important, I'll just machine piece the border, did that. Then made her quilt sandwich and hand quilted the center, and then thought, again, the border's not quite as important, and machine quilted the border. But let's take a closer look. All right, let's take a look at this border and see if you can see what I mean here. So this fabric is thicker, right, than this. So this is all of the hand quilting here. This is hand quilted. This is hand quilted. But then when you get out here, this is hand quilted right here, but then this is machine quilted. So by the time you get out here, it's machine done. And then this is machine pieced. So it's interesting. And then what about the binding? The binding is hand done. The binding is hand done. So let's just look at these flowers. There's a stain in the middle, small stain in the middle. But each one of the flowers is different, and the birds are all made out of different fabric. It looks like the fabric is reversed on the bird, so the body is the wing and the body is the wing. But the cactus is very funny. And then there's some hand embroidery for the little cactus points there. And I really love these patterned fabrics that the maker used. I don't think I'll show you every single one, but you get the idea. There's a daffodil. You can see if you can name all these flowers. Is that an iris maybe? I'm not a gardener, so I don't know what these are, but these are these snowbells or something they're called? Is this, oh, this is a lily. Maybe that's a, I can't remember the name of that one. That's a daffodil, perhaps. So there you go. So that's this quilt, and I will say that the middle part of the quilt that was hand pieced and hand quilted feels so much better than the border, and I kind of think about that for my own quilt making, and you know, you have to wonder, is that because the outer fabric is a little thicker and so it's less pliable, or is it because the middle really was hand pieced and hand quilted that it feels so wonderful, or maybe a little combination of both. But I would like to start trying some hand quilting. I am doing a little hand piecing, but the hand quilting takes some commitment, but it might be worth it. Here is the second quilt. My Uncle Timmy gave me this quilt because it's not in good shape. It is very, very stained, and I would say that I made it worse, not in terms of the staining, but I damaged it a bit in some places in desperately trying to get the stains out and using my washing machine, which you really shouldn't use your washing machine for antique quilts, but I had tried a variety of ways to get the quilts out or the stains out, and at some point I was like, they're not coming out. So I did machine wash it, which did cause some damage, and it still didn't get the stains out. So I know you're all gonna comment and tell me all the different ways that I can try and get these stains out, but I am telling you, they are permanent. They are there, they are not coming out. I have tried all kinds of ways, and they are all over both the pink and the white. You're not really going to be able to see, I think, in the video, because when I get close enough to show the stains, I think it's going to get fuzzy, but I will try. I'll try and show you what I'm talking about. Now, let's just do that, and then we'll talk more about the quilt. Okay, so I think you can actually see here. So every part of the white is this stained. You can kind of see, and then also it's starting to shred a little bit. You can't see it as well on the video in the pink, but some of the darker spots you can see, you know, like here and here. But what you can't see is that really the whole thing is stained. And every one of the white blocks is very visibly stained. But it is hand pieced, it's hand quilted. I love the coloring on this, the pink and this kind of creamy white. But as you can see, the whole thing, it's just stained. So I thought about a couple things with this quilt, because you can't really, when it gets to that point of being that damaged, you don't really want to put it on your bed or your guest bed or have it on the couch. I mean, I would. I love it. I love this quilt so much. I love the design. I love that color pink. You're not going to find that color pink in a solid anywhere nowadays. It's just not going to happen. It almost has like it's like a tannish brownish pink almost, and the 9 patch in between each one of the stars, the fact it's hand pieced and hand quilted, this quilt feels amazing. Like when you snuggle under it, it feels so good. So what do? I thought about a couple things, the first of which I think is unrealistic, but I thought about hand piecing. Since the pink is not as bad as the cream, I thought about hand appliquing over every single part of the cream, which seems a little crazy, and why I decided not to do that is because I think it would take, to add that much fabric over the white, it would take away the feeling of how it feels right now. Not to mention, I don't think it would look very good, and I think it would be incredibly time consuming, and I would end up being very frustrated with this. But that's an option. I could still do that. I could just leave it and just have it be stained and snuggle under it, but I don't know. I mean, it's really, really, really stained. I don't really want, I think I made my point. I don't really want to keep it as is. I mean, I want to keep it, but I don't want to use it as is. The other thing I was thinking, which is a little controversial, and I've always been really vocally opposed to this, like very vocally opposed. I've done like full videos on this about making quilt coats out of antique quilts. I'm very opposed to cutting up antique quilts and vintage quilts to make clothing and bags and all sorts of things that people are making right now. If you know about that topic, you know that it's a big fad right now. People are selling antique quilts in bulk for very cheap so that people can do this and sell the garments. I'm very opposed to it. In the video that I made about it, people were not so opposed to it. I thought all you quilting folks would comment and be like, this is horrible, and you really weren't. Some of you were like, it is horrible, and other people were like, I don't care what happens to my quilt when I'm dead. But I'm still of the opinion that I don't like the idea of cutting up vintage and antique quilts to make clothing. But, I mean, this could be a contender because it is pretty damaged. It's would make a beautiful coat. So I don't think that I actually could when push comes to shove. I did recently buy a quilt coat pattern because I want to make my own quilt and turn it into a coat, because that's really, I mean, that's what, I don't want to say what people should be doing. People should do what they want, but they should not be cutting up antique quilts, and they should be making their own quilts and turning them into coats, which is what I want to do. So I have the pattern for a quilt coat, so I could do it, right? But I don't think I can. So I don't know what I'm gonna do with this quilt. Maybe you have some suggestions. Let's look at the last quilt, which is a family heirloom. I recently inherited a family heirloom that I'm super excited about. Let's look at it. This is a grandmother's flower garden pattern, which is very appropriate because the maker of this was my husband's great-grandmother. My husband's great-grandmother made this quilt. It's a hexagon quilt. We'll get a closer look in a second. Now, this is also stained. The white is stained on this, which makes me think two things. Number one, in making my quilts, I just naturally don't use a lot of white because I will just get it dirty while I'm making the quilt. Like, not, you know, forget about like 100 years from now and the white will be stained. I will, you know, be eating a chocolate bar while I'm making my quilt and I will get it dirty. So I tend to not use white very frequently, almost at all. And so seeing the last quilt and this quilt with the white, with the stainage so prominently on the white, I like feel really good about my choice in terms of attempting not to use white. The staining on this doesn't bother me quite as much. Actually, it doesn't bother me at all. I don't mind the staining on this quilt at all. I don't know why. I don't know why it bothers me so much on the other one and not on this one. Maybe it's because it's a family heirloom, maybe because there's less white on this one, but I will show you. Let's get a closer look at the fabrics. The fabrics are great. So I think this quilt was made in the early 1940s. So Derek's grandmother, who's still alive, just gave me this quilt over the summer. And she said that she was so, you'd have to do the math. Derek's grandmother is currently like in her mid-90s, and she remembered her mother stitching this when she was like 8 years old. So I think that's like the early 1940s, but I'd have to get a calculator out to do that math. You can figure it out. What I also love about this quilt is the Depression era green. I've always heard and seen pictures of quilts around the, you know, that have the Depression era green, because this green was not invented until, and now I'm going to tell you wrong information, I don't know, around the Depression, or like 1930s, I think this green was invented. And so people started to use it a ton around that time period. So this is, you know, what experts refer to as Depression era green. And I'm really excited that it's used in this quilt that I now own. Let's take a closer look at the quilt. So all the centers are this yellow, which is also stained. You know, when it's hanging up, you just see the stain so much more, but you can see, like here, you don't really see the stains because the fabric blends it, but you really see it on the solid fabric and the white. But I don't know, I'm not even gonna try and wash this, but it's all hand pieced and then hand quilted, the whole thing. And then it has this really interesting border here. Actually, I'll look at the border. We'll look at the border when I back up, and then it has the yellow backing. And this quilt feels great to lie under, and those fabrics are just, they're so beautiful. Here's one with ducks with hats. It's so funny. The last thing I wanted to say about the stainage of both this quilt and the previous one is that people tend to obsess about getting the stains out. If you take a museum like the International Quilt Museum, I recently saw a video by them, and it said that they never wash any part of any quilt. They don't even hand treat the spots or anything. If there's a stain on it, they keep the stain there. The only treatment that they do is they use a teeny tiny vacuum, and they vacuum the whole thing so it gets all the dirt up and any, you know, any grossness that might be on there. They use a teeny tiny vacuum, and then they seal them. They isolate the quilts for a certain period of time in case there's any bugs or whatever, because they don't want, you know, if a quilt has some kind of living thing on it, they don't want that to infect the other quilts in their collection. So they isolate it, and then they use a teeny tiny vacuum, but all the stains, they just stay. So maybe that's just something to think about. I don't know. And then I wanted to show you the border here. How it kind of, the hexagon kind of comes out pretty far on each one of the edgings here. It's kind of cool. So there's the 3 quilts, and Legacy, the story of Tallulah Gilbert Bottoms and her quilts by Nancilu Burdick, Nancilu, last name Burdick. Check that out if you want to. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.